Hello everyone. In this series of video, I will be discussing about social identity, prejudice, stereotype, and discrimination. Since this material is quite long, it will be divided into two parts. So let's start the first part. Now let's start with this. If someone asks you this question, tell me about you. What are some of the information that you would be giving to him or her? Chances are, you may say that you are friendly or outgoing, which represent your traits, characters, or personality. You may also mention about your hobbies, what you like, or your interests. But during the conversation, you may also mention about that you are a student or a teacher, perhaps your ethnicity or where you're from, gender, and depending on the situation, you may even mention your religion. The latter group of information is example of what is called as social identity. If you are, for example, a male Christian Batakis Indonesian teacher, then you're at least possessing 5 different social identities, which are gender, ethnicity, religion, occupational, and nationality. So now, try to reflect on yourself. What are your social identities? The first group of the information I mentioned earlier, as some of the information you might be giving to the other person, could be considered as your personal identity. The personal identity distinguishes yourself from the other members of your own group. So let's say that you belong to the student as your occupational identity. What makes you different from the other students in your class, in your batch, or even typical student in general? Then this will represent you as an individual. A social identity, on the other hand, will distinguish you from the members of the other group. So if you are a university student, you will distinguish yourself from the lecturer, the university staff, even students at lower or higher level of education. Unlike personal identity that compares yourself and others in intragroup level, the social identity allows you to make comparison between yourself and others on the intergroup level. The distinction between the personal identity, social identity, and other types of identity is explained in social identity theory. So in the 70s, Henry Touchwell conducted a study that was called the Minimal Group Paradigm Studies, in which he just basically randomly assigned 14 to 15-year-old boys into arbitrary groups, so not real group, and asked them to allocate money to members of their own group and the other group, or that's called the out group. So what he found here was basically the mere knowledge of the existence that there is another group beside their own group, beside our own group, would trigger some sort of competition between our own group and the other group. So social identity is defined as the individual's knowledge that he or she belongs to certain social groups, together with some emotional and value significance to him or her of this group membership. So how it happened? It happened through the process that's called self-categorization. So basically, we're kind of reflecting on ourselves, and we are categorizing ourselves into at least 3 identities. Human identity, our identity as human beings, we are basically the same as the other human beings. Our social identities, as I have already mentioned earlier, the examples, and also our own individual and personal identity. So what's the consequence of social categorization that triggers social identity? So here we would put ourselves into a certain group where we feel that we belong to that group. It can be based on some similarities that we have with the other group members of that group. Then we will call the group members our own, the members of our own group as in-group. And then we will distinguish ourselves with the members of the other group. And we call them as the out-group. So here, the social identity or the possession of social identity basically aims to enhance ourselves. So we try to belong to a certain group to basically enhance our self-esteem, to improve our self-esteem. So what's the consequence of that? It means that we must belong to a certain group that we feel highly appreciated about. So we feel very proud of. So that our self-esteem will also be improved, right? So if we are a member of a very, the best group, for example, in the society, then we would feel very proud that we are a member of a very prestigious group. Then what will happen next is that there will be a phenomenon that's called the in-group favoritism, where we would be, too proud of our own group. We would be so, too happy about our own group, and at the same time is, derogating the other group or the out group. So there's in-group favoritism, and also there's out-group derogation, where we feel very proud of our own group and discriminating or derogating the people or the members of the other group. The discussion about in-group and out-group and the relations between them brings us about how members of different groups perceive each other and the way they are being treated. To discuss about this, we should talk about stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. Stereotype is defined as beliefs about typical characteristics of certain group members. So let's say about the university student group, we might have, some beliefs about university student groups, the characteristics of university students. So we might think about that, okay, university students must be smart, must be polite, must be disciplined, maybe hardworking, studying a lot, etc. Which also means that we also have stereotypes about the group of non-university students, which could be the opposite or could be similar. So now we challenge you. Identify known types of stereotypes that you are aware of. So it could be something that you are knowingly or maybe unknowingly using in your life, or something that you have heard before, maybe from the media or from something else. One of the most important stereotype is gender stereotype. So we can see here that we tend to have this stereotype about boys and girls, that boys are strong and girls are sensitive. And there are even lists of stereotypic traits that associated with women and men. So for example, for female traits are usually including warm, emotional, kind, or polite, sensitive, follower, weak, friendly, fashionable, and gentle. While for the male stereotype typically include competent, stable, tough, self-confident, leader, strong, accomplished, non-conformist, and aggressive. There are several types of modern stereotype of gender that affects people's life. So the first one is the glass ceiling. This is a final barrier that prevents women as a group from reaching top positions in the workplace. So basically, because of some of the stereotypes associated to women that I already mentioned earlier, so women could not reach the top leadership position in their career. So they can only reach to a certain point, but could not break it through until the very top leadership position. Then the second modern stereotype of gender related to singleism. This is the negative stereotyping and discrimination that is directed toward people who are single. So typically, people who are single are stereotyped as, colder, like less friendly than the people who are married or having or in type of some romantic relationship. And for women who are single, have more negative stereotype than single men. Then there's also the glass cliff effect. So women are indeed more likely to gain admittance to valued leadership positions when a crisis has occurred. The leadership position is more precarious and therefore there is greater risk of failure. So yes, there might be some situation where women could reach to the very top position of the leadership, but typically it accompanies with a very critical situation in the company or in the organization, which means that the risk for failure is higher than when it is in a normal situation. So this sort of kind of like confirm, that the stereotype that women cannot be leader, because when they go into the top position of the leadership, they fail. Yeah, many of them fail, but actually it's probably not because of their incompetence. It could also be just because of the situation, that it was a critical situation that maybe anyone who will be in that leadership position would fail, regardless of the gender. In reality, we have witnessed that few women has basically broken the glass ceiling. So they move into the very top of the leadership position in the country, in organization, in the society. But when the glass ceiling has been broken by a few number of people only, is it good or bad? This phenomenon is called tokenism, when a few members of a previously excluded group are admitted into that very exclusive group. Research has shown that there are some consequences of tokenism. Well, it has been shown that tokenism is a highly effective strategy for reducing collective protests in disadvantaged groups. So there is a decrease in the number of protests by the members of disadvantaged group. However, people hired as token representatives of their groups are perceived quite negatively by other members of the organization. They may be perceived as less competent because people assume that they were hired because of the quota or because they are a member of a certain disadvantaged group, certain minority groups, and not because of their competence. This will also damage the self-esteem and confidence of the target members of the prejudice. So for example, if women or some women are hired to be in a leadership position just because they are women, so they would perceive themselves, if they knew that they were hired based on their gender, then they themselves would perceive themselves, as less competent, because they found out that, oh, it's not because of my competence that I got hired to this job, but it's just because I'm a woman and perhaps I'm the only woman who applied to this job. So for sure, it will damage the confidence and the self-esteem of that person. Another consequence of the social categorization that triggers in-group favoritism and out-group derogation is there is a tendency to highly value our own group and to underestimate the other group. So we will see that our groups, with more positive stereotypes, and give the outgroup with more negative stereotypes. So typically, when we use positive stereotype to the other groups or the outgroups, then we use an accurate assessment process. So the output would be liking the other group, because we see them positively. But when we use negative stereotype, typically we use limited information in the assessment process. So we might be just using existing schema that we have learned since we were young, whether it's accurate or inaccurate. We would also use this, kind of like correlation. Typically, this happened, yesterday this happened, which means that this another thing would happen. We use illusory correlation when we try to connect two things that are actually not interconnected, like gender and competence. These two are actually not interconnected. But because, typically when women goes into the top leadership, then they would fail. So that's illusory correlation that might actually rooted from the existing schema that we have. So the output would be hating the other group because we would perceive the other group negatively due to the negative stereotypes or beliefs that we have towards that other group. So how does stereotype occur? So stereotype occurs at least on the basis of two things. That's cognition and affection. You know, the cognition processes include the selective attention, appraisal, concept formation and categorization, attribution, and memory. So, as I've already mentioned earlier, with the social identity and self-categorization theory, we tend to have, limited ability in our cognition. So what we do whenever we meet stranger for the first time, we would automatically do self-categorization. So categorization is something that's natural. Everyone is doing it. So we are just categorizing people into gender, maybe race or ethnicity, maybe age or anything else, others type of social categories. So categorization is actually helping our cognition to simplify a lot of the information that we get from the world to make quicker decision. Yeah. However, if this categorization is accompanied by the feeling of in-group and out-group, by the feeling of us and them, and by more affective feelings like dislike and like, love and hate, then this will create problem. So stereotype or categorization itself, is something that's natural, but when it's accompanied with more negative feelings, especially, then that might create problems that will create prejudice and perhaps discrimination at the behavior level. All right, that's the first part. Thank you.